This unit particularly focuses on not only on romanticism but romantic poetry and certain poets that you need to know something about. There's this background of romantic movement first, then they talk about certain definitions and then salient features of romanticism. Then comes the early romantic poets. Yes, we are not going to study them, one by one, but these are the names that should be there in your mind that romantic poetry did not occur over the night. It took some time for William Wordsworth or Coleridge to take charge. And why they are prominent for romanticism or romantic poetry? Because they wrote about it. Yes, these poets that you can see on your screen highlighted, they were writing about it knowingly and unknowingly. It's very unlikely that the poet knows that he's writing from the perspective of Victorian poetry, medieval English literature, or Anglo Saxon poetry. They did not know that they were writing for certain ages. Yes, they had some influences perhaps, but they were not writing it keeping in mind that this poem will fall into this category or that category. It is the critics or the readers that are able to pinpoint or tell which category certain poet could belong to. So these writers such as James Thomson, Mark Akenside, Joseph Warton, William Collins, Thomas Gray, William Cowper, ये सारे जो हैं, all of them, they wrote in such a manner that probably creaks of or loudly or explicitly showcased characteristics of romantic poetry. Then Robert Burns is somebody who's separately has been discussed in this chapter because his themes, form, diction, vocabulary items, even rhyming schemes, and the subject matter of his poems were very different from the earlier writers that were there. Then came William Blake. Blake is also one of the um, pioneers of or unsaid or unclaimed pioneer of romantic poetry, has written a book called Songs of Innocence, in which he says that in order to understand innocence, one must understand corruption. In order to understand the daylight, one must understand the night. So it's very important to go in comparisons and contrasts, and that is what he does in his poetry. Then comes William Wordsworth and Coleridge, and then there's the second generation of romantic poets. We are concerned with William Wordsworth and Shelley and Keats. Uh, we can talk about Coleridge as well if we are left with some time later on. But in order to understand how Wordsworth and his mind works, we need to study something about Coleridge as well. So we'll be talking about theory of poetry, practice of this theory, and what collaboration or partnership William Wordsworth and Coleridge shared with each other. So this unit clearly defines certain characteristics and salient features of romanticism. It also introduces the audiences with romantic poems and movement in England. They have highlighted this work, which is called The Preface to Lyrical Ballads. It is critically acclaimed throughout the history because it focuses on how and what the characteristics of a poet and poem should be, specifically a romantic poet and romantic poet. Then Coleridge Biographia Literaria is also there because it illustrated how actual writing of romantic poetry was taken on. Then comes the background. Background has already been discussed in the other handout, where we came to an understanding that there were many revolutions that took place that made the radicals and the liberals in England an enthusiastic support system to romantic movement. And then we also have talked about the American Revolution that led to Declaration of Independence by the 13 colonies. So it also has something to do with the history of what was happening, what kind of reform bills were there. Walter Scott has been mentioned, and much more. Then, if we talk about James Watt's steam engine, which replaced wind. So they are talking about, environmental degradation, and they're also bothered about, the poets of romantic poetry are bothered about scientific inventions. They talk about industrialization, technological development that led to a level of detachment between human beings and the relationships they grow saw. सो ये सारी जो एक बैकग्राउंड में स्टडी है वो चलती रही है, ठीक है. Then the romantic writers, they lived through many moments and changes in political, economic, social, and military spheres, and the revolution also brought the spirit of the age to a certain understanding. Then comes the certain definitions of romanticism. I'll just read one or two, the rest may be read by yourself. The term romanticism is controversial. For Lucas, in his book, The Decline and the Fall of Romantic Ideal, written in 1948, counted as many as 11,396 definitions. That's a huge amount of definitions. Of course, every writer out there, they were able to categorize romantic poetry into certain label or category themselves. This particular term, it comes from Rome. In the 7th and 8th century, there were three main languages: Europe, lingua latina, which was the language of the scholars; lingua barbara, which was the language of Germanic tribes; and lingua romana rustica, which was a group of vulgar Latin dialects from which the Romance languages, namely French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, are derived. The term romantic is related to Romance languages and peripheral tradition rather than to Latin, the main tradition. So you do understand that the language that is going to be used in Romantic age, specifically in England, comes from many other, bricks, many other flavors of languages in the history. Now, for Wordsworth and Coleridge, who worked together for some time, never applied the term romantic to themselves. Like I told you, the writers who are writing, they do not, label themselves that we are this and we are that. It's the writers and the critics and the scholars of that age, they come up with such understanding. The important point that we need to understand that rationalism and agnosticism, the age of reasoning, was something that came before it, and romanticism definitely had some political overtones as well. The term implies a literary and philosophical theory which tends to see the individual at very center of all life and all experiences. The individual is placed at the center of art. Remember the characteristics that we studied in previous class, that romanticism has imagination, nature, individualism, and other concepts as well. Then comes the salient features of Romanticism. Romanticism is opposed to the artificial conventions, the reigning literary traditions, and the poetic establishment. Then there's a comparison given between neoclassical poetry and Romanticism that you already know. Then they talk about the function of poetry according to this view is to instruct and to please. Art is a mirror in which we find a reflection of life. For romantics, the source of poetry is the poet himself. As Wordsworth puts it, poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It is an inborn gift and not something acquired. Poetry is the expression of emotion. The poet's imagination creates poetry. The traditional view that poetry is the painstaking endeavor is discarded by romantics, which means that they just revolted against the neoclassical or everything that came before them, and they truly believed in the spontaneity of the powerful feelings that may overcome the writer to write in tranquility. Blake thought that poetry comes from the inspiration, vision, and prophecy. Keats said that poetry should come as naturally as the leaves of a tree. So you see, all these romantic poets, such as Wordsworth, William Blake, Keats, even Coleridge, and other Lord Byron, Shelley, etc., they come up with their own layer of meaning that they attach with romanticism or romantic poetry. Romantic poets were innovative in terms of form, themes, and style. Lowly and eccentric characters like an idiot boy or a leech gatherer are material for poetic treatment by Wordsworth. Like I told you, the subject matter of romantic poetry is meant for common people and it is written about common people. Before this, nobody would have dared to write about an idiot boy or a leech gatherer or a village girl for that matter. But Wordsworth made this contribution clearly, loud and clear, that he's interested in the common people and he's going to write in such a diction that will make sense for the common people. Then supernatural themes are also used by Coleridge and Keats, such as Coleridge has used the supernatural entities in the Kubla Khan, the ancient mariner. Keats has used it in the Eve and of Saint Agnes. Moreover, romantic poetry has also dealt with far away and long ago, which means the romantic poetry is also nostalgic. It takes a detour down the memory lane. It's also the poetry of nature. It's also poetry of childhood. Wordsworth mostly focuses on his childhood memories and then he compares and contrasts it with that current time and he automatically becomes the poet of nature, a poet of childhood memory and nostalgia. Romantic poetry also, draws its attention and inspiration from folk literature and middle ages of classical antiquity as well. And they also has the ability to use symbolism as technique, such as notably used by Blake and Shelley. The poem The West Wind and Ode to Skylark are very good examples in which Shelley actually talks about how he got amused by the wind and he started writing about it. And then he talks about a skylark and then how he's inspired by it. Now, being inspired by a bird or a natural phenomena or a wind or water or a waterfall is something that was not in the books or comprehension of the neoclassicists or all the poets or writers which came before the romantic poets. Therefore, it makes romantic poetry innovative, creative, active, and unique as compared to the other ones. The Romantic poets displaced humanity by external nature as poetic subject matter, so the description of landscape and its aspects became prominent, right? While neoclassics or neoclassical poetry is written on other people, such as Pope's The Rape of the Lock. Now, romantic poetry is about poet himself, which means just remember that poetry of romantic age was more inclined towards the subjectivity, the personal feelings of a poet, personal observations of the poet, and neoclassical poetry was focused on general phenomena. It wanted to talk about the social hierarchies and much more. Another significant innovation is the use of ordinary language for ordinary people. Uh, the poets of Romanticism do not use any lofty diction. Then classicism and romanticism are generally considered somewhat antithetical. Classicism is concerned with the social, the formal, and the intellectual, and the static, whereas romanticism is concerned with the individual, informal, and emotional and dynamic. Thus, the Romantic movement was a revolutionary movement in many ways. Right? Then they have mentioned certain poets that you'll understand later on. Then they have given some information about those poets that I showed you earlier. Jesse James Thompson has been mentioned. Mark Akenside has been mentioned. Now look at the language that he's using. Mark, he says, I'm just going to read two or three lines. Once more, search, undismayed, the dark profound where nature works in secret. View the beds of mineral treasure and the threatened wall that bounds the hoary ocean, trace the forms of atoms moving with incensed change. अब देखिए लैंग्वेज जो है ये नियो क्लासिकल लैंग्वेज से काफ़ी चेंज है. Then Joseph Wharton is there, William Collins is there. See, he's using air, using the imagery of beetle, he's using the imagery of twilight. Nature के जो भी phenomena है उनको वो use करके अपनी बात put across करते हैं. Then Thomas Gray is there, William Cowper is there, and then we comes to Robert Burns. Burns is one of the most beloved poets of the Scots. He's also a symbol of their national spirit, right? He really had romantic tendencies in his work. He was steeped into Scottish folklore. He loved freedom, and he definitely respected common men, and therefore he wrote about it. He was attracted by nature, and he swam against the current traditions and fashions of his age. The use of folk song is there. Themes are generally death, birth, youth, old age, love, and grief. Form that he has used is focused on folk poetry. Riddles and tests could be there. Birds and flowers are given human qualities, which means he has used personification. Number three is significant. Three riddles, three actions, and etc. Vocabulary is simple, the diction is simple. Many stock phrases are used because of the origins of folk poetry. Then rhyme is used. Okay, there is a writing rhyming scheme that he has used. See, a fig for those by law protected, liberty's a glorious feast. Courts for cowards were erected, churches built to please the priest. Protected, erected, feast, priest. So this is how rhythmic pattern was maintained. Then came love poems. Love poems do not necessarily mean the romantic and vulgar poems. I won't call them vulgar poems, the modern poems, but they are more inclined towards the intimacy of human beings with each other. But in romanticism, in this romanticism that we are discussing, yes, it is about relationships as well and the intimacy of relationship, but that is not necessarily confided to romantic relationships or sexual relationships or intimate physical relationships. It's more subtle than that. It is more intellectual and philosophical than that. For example, the relationship a person can share with a building or with a place, a garden he used to enjoy when he was a little boy. तो इस तरह की poems भी आपको मिलेंगी that will fall into love poems as well. अच्छा इसमें all these exercises can help you come to an understanding of this handout, so you should practice these exercises yourself. Now we finally move to William Blake. I've already told you about Songs of Innocence. He has written Songs of Experience. He's written The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. So all of these things, they are talk about extreme sense of freedom and happiness to the condition of childhood. So his poetry is didactic, and he wanted people to free themselves from conventions and traditions. He was more revolutionary in themes, diction, and technique than Burns or Wordsworth, but his genius was not recognized in his lifetime. So you see, because he was writing in a certain light, but usually it is also considerably accepted by people across the world that in order to get highlighted, in order to get noticed, people have to die to become legends. When they are alive, they are not appreciated, and once they die, they are appreciated more. Then comes William Wordsworth. Since we are going to study Tintin Abbey from Wordsworth, so we are going to discuss William Wordsworth in detail. Now, Wordsworth is a prominent leader of Romantic movement in England. He supported the French Revolution in its early phase, but his liberalism gradually dwindled. In 1795, he met Coleridge, and this meeting was beneficial for both of them. They jointly authored lyrical ballads, which is considered to be the beginning of romantic movement in England. So you see why they are given more importance as compared to the other poets, because they gave a book on it. They wrote a critical, um, you know, a Wikipedia or encyclopedia about what a poet, a romantic poet, and romantic poetry should be, and therefore they are always attributed with the pioneering and fathering of the romantic movement. In the book, they have talked about the guiding principles of this new movement, and in addition to many lyrics, Wordsworth wrote the Prelude, a sort of spiritual autobiography, as its subtitle, The Growth of a Poet's Mind, indicates. As the title suggests, the Prelude is the first of a three-part poem, The Recluse. The second part, entitled The Excursion, was published, but the third part was never written. The prelude is actually about his childhood, it's about his growth, and he eventually moves forward to uh, personal growth to the poetic inspiration. He's better known for his poem Tintin Abbey and Immortality Ode, and these are long works and they're ambitious works as well. They are, Tintin Abbey specifically recounts three stages in development: the poet's love for nature, sensuous animal passion, moral influence, and mystical communication. Michael deals with the sturdiness of character and nature's healing power. The five Lucy poems are the popular ones. In Ode on Intimations of Immortality, Wordsworth attributes a child's wisdom and glory to the unconscious memory of a previous life. And then there are other poems mentioned. We are most likely to discuss Tintin Abbey. Then comes his theory of poetry. We've already discussed that he mentions that there are certain characteristics of a poet and a poem, and that those characteristics are called in mentioned in lyrical ballads, and these observations are prefixed in the book, and they are also given in the edition of 1800. First, he says the question of the subject matter. He believes that incident and situations from common life must be added to the poetry. He thought that the rustic and the humble life is better suited for the essential passion of the heart. The phrases that you see in the inverted commas, these are the textual references from the book called Preface to Lyrical Ballads. So if you're going to quote these lines, these phrases, you must also write it in inverted commas. He believed that the emotions of rural people are similar, purer, and perhaps better than those of city dweller. Also thought that people living in the midst of nature have a better moral attitude, and they become part of the sense of divinity present in nature. The second innovation is the use of selection of language used by men. He wanted to use language that was meant for common people, understandable for common people, and written in common ways. So his choice, he explained throughout the preface, was what repeatedly stated that simple and unelaborated expression as his choice. And he further says, and I quote, "My purpose was to imitate and to and as far as possible to adopt the very language of men, and such personifications do not make any natural or regular part of the language." So, if you're going to talk about his diction, that if you're going to discuss William Wordsworth, a poet of nature, or a romantic poet, these pointers must be there. Wordsworth finds a moral justification for poetry. He says the aim of a poet, in his view, is to correct men's feeling, render these feelings more consonant with eternal nature. Now, the creative process is explained by Wordsworth in following words. These are very important. You should remember at least half of it so that you can uh, discuss Wordsworth as a poet of nature, Wordsworth as a poet of romantic age, Wordsworth as a spiritual poet, poet of childhood, poet of memory, poet of comparison and contrasts, and much more. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. The emotion is contemplated till, by a species of reactions, the tranquility gradually disappears, and an emotion kindred to that which was therefore the subject of contemplation is gradually produced, and does itself actually exist in the mind. In this mood, successfully, Coin's position generally begins, and in a mood similar to this is carried on. So, implicitly, in his explanation of how poetry is created, it is a psychological approach that it should take place in the mind only. It should be occurring and taking place within the mind. Then he discussed the difference between language of poetry and the languages of prose, that we already know that there should be some, differences. Meter seems to give poetry a kind of unreality. He says, the end of poetry is to produce excitement in coexistent existence with the overbalance of pleasure. Okay? The romantic gives high place to the poet. They endow him with the ability to speak to other men. Wordsworth asserts in his book, he, which means the poet, is a man speaking to men, a man, it is true, endowed with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness, who has greater knowledge of human nature and a comprehensive soul than the supposed to be common among humankind. Then he says, a poet is related to other men who have the same ingredients, but the poet has them in greater measure. Thus, the preface discusses a wide range of topics concerning poetry and the innovations which lyrical ballads has introduced. Then comes Wordsworth's practice of his theory. Again, they are going to mention the prelude, Immortality Ode. These poems are well known, and he has used the recurrent, incurable, discordant, which are polysyllabic words derived from Latin. Then there are archaisms like showed, de- desired की जगह dined, sprinkles की जगह traps. There are also inventions of words, word order in pluraces like by the vision splendid for the sake of the rhyme. In resolution and independence, we have himself, propped limbs, body, and pale face, motionless as a cloud that old man stood. So the language that he started using, that language was simple language. For us, it might not be simple because we do not have much knowledge about the amusements that these poets got from, because we are starting directly from Wordsworth. Then his partnership with Coleridge. They become friends in 1795. Coleridge spotted a talent in Wordsworth and praised him as the best poet of the age. The two friends met at, almost daily, discussed poetry, and they had their own large quantities of poetry. They had their own journeys, although they both are called romantic poets, but they are different from each other. Their approaches are different from each other. Of the two sorts of poetry based on theme, Coleridge agreed to choose the supernatural, and Wordsworth chose ordinary. For Wordsworth, nature or romanticism is something that is felt in the physical presence in the you know physical world, but for the Coleridge it's more abstract, that may take place in the imagination and dreams. So that makes Coleridge even more complicated than Wordsworth. However, serious differences developed between the two on important questions. Coleridge did not agree with many parts of the preface. He objected to them as he considered them erroneous, which means full of errors. Some of Wordsworth's statements appear to contradict other parts of the same preface and author's own practice in the great number of points themselves. On such question was the difference between language of poetry and that of prose. Wordsworth thought that there was no essential difference between the two. Coleridge thought they were different. He argued that meter is essential for poetry, which implies passion. So they did have differences, but they had many similarities. Then comes the introduction to Coleridge. Um, then there are certain poets, the second generation of poet, Lord Byron, Shelley, and Keats. We'll talk about these poets in detail once we, reach their poems. I would like to start today with each poet because that might confuse some of you. So we'll just stop at Wordsworth so that we can start his poem instead. But we'll come back to these readings as well. You should read at your own as well. That will definitely help you understand what has happened. So, this unit has made an attempt to give you much information about romantic movement. Then, certain key definitions and salient features have been discussed. Wordsworth's principles and his actual practices have been discussed. Now, further questions that may help you come to an inference are given. You can definitely read, and certain readings are also given. And then self assessment exercises are there. You can read. I hope the introduction to romantic poetry was sufficient. Did understand what's happening and how to go about it. Now you have like 10 minutes to go through this handout, and if you have any questions, you may ask.